where to begin? Okay, so your test for like the new information is gonna have like three main sections: the Civil Rights Movement, the Johnson and Nixon era, and then the Vietnam War. So since there's only three of us, scale of 1 to 10, how do we feel about the Civil Rights Movement? I'm gonna talk about it, but like how deep do I need to go into it?
What time does your phone say? Because mine's wrong, obviously.
Anyways, scale of 1 to 10. 0. Like 10 being an expert, 0 meaning you know nothing? Okay, cool, let's start there. Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so let's start with the why. Why was the Civil Rights Movement happening? Well, let's put some dates up here. This is the 1960s. So why in the 1960s, out of all the time in the world, why now?
This is right after the war.
Okay, so how did World War II get us to this point?
Because they allowed the blacks and everyone into the war.
Wasn't it like trying to end racial discrimination or some junk like that?
So after World War II, I'm just going to abbreviate, African Americans wanted military integration. And then that spark of like military integration is what's going to prompt desegregation in schools and buses and all other areas of segregation. So we have World War II. What else? There's some instances, like specifically in World War II, that made Americans kind of question and look at ourselves in the mirror during World War II. We're still talking about why now. How would the Holocaust make us look? If we're out there helping Jews, saying Hitler did all these bad things.
It's opening America up.
What do you mean? Yes? What? A good way to say it is America is faced with its own injustices. Like, we are faced to deal with and faced to... Are you trying to review right now, Julian?
No, I was looking to get you to like 320. So I'm just sitting there.
All right, well, you can learn a little something too. So America is faced with its own injustices, because think about if we sit all high and mighty saying we rescued the Jews from the Holocaust, we did all these great things during World War II, but then we don't even give our own people equality, and we don't even treat our own people and give them equal amounts of rights. So what rights were African Americans denied before the Civil Rights Movement?
Right to vote.
Which is which right?
Suffrage?
Like a number? Thinking of a number.
15th.
Yes, the 15th Amendment is denied to African Americans, which is the right to vote. And so, can you think of some ways that maybe like KKK and other radical groups in the South were denying African Americans this right to vote?
Literacy test?
Denied to African Americans by literacy tests. What else? Catherine.
Just physically stopping?
Sure. I'm just gonna put KKK. But like physically, like not allowing them to go and vote.
The grandfather clause.
Uh-huh. The grandfather clause. And poll taxes, everyone's favorite. So, not only do you need to know about like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but it's good to know why are we having the civil rights movement in this time. So, can I move this?
What?
Excuse me?
I didn't hear what you
I
said.
said, can I move this? And then Selena said no. Okay. So you actually don't need to know like a ton about like the sit-ins and the bus boycotts, but you do need to know like the legal aspect of the civil rights movement. So a good question to be able to answer is, how did LBJ how did LBJ establish equality? So while LBJ was president, we talked about how he implemented a lot of the ideas of JFK. And so some people might argue like they weren't really his ideas at all. He was just doing what JFK would have done if he hadn't have been assassinated. But LBJ as president gets Congress to enforce and implement several different laws and pieces of legislation that change the lives of African Americans and give them those rights that they had been denied. Such as, what is that one law that is like the end all be all for the civil rights movement, and it gives equal rights to all African Americans, and it ends all segregation?
Is that an amendment?
No.
What's it start with?
A C?
Civil Rights Act.
The Civil Rights Act. During the Civil Rights Movement, there was the Civil Rights Act. That's easy to remember. So the Civil Rights Act, where's your brain? You already know it. Ends all segregation. All segregation. In buses and schools, by Julian, every aspect of society was now going to be integrated, and it makes, if you do discriminate or if you are racist in a place of work or school, whatever, now you could be prosecuted, you could get in trouble for those things. And so it's good to know like which president did what, so make sure you link this with LBJ. And then a second one, LBJ he got Congress to help African Americans be able to vote through literally the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act ends all discrimination. Ends all discrimination at the polls. So no more literacy tests, no more poll taxes, no more grandfather clauses, all of those things that had maybe limited their ability to vote are now going to be illegal. And then there's going to be a third one, and it has to do with giving people the ability to live wherever they want. It's called the Fair Housing Act, and it's kind of in the name. It ends discrimination in terms of buying a house, getting an apartment. Like they can't say, oh, you're black, you can't live here, or you're 85-year-old woman and you're handicapped, you can't live here. You can't discriminate in terms of homes. Does all that make sense? So make sure you link these, though. Most importantly, know what they are. Make sure you link them with LBJ and how he really does a lot for the civil rights movement. Before LBJ, though, there are two Supreme Court cases that you should be familiar with. Did you need this? Here. One that begins segregation and makes it legal, and then one that ends segregation and makes segregation illegal. What is the Supreme Court case that makes segregation illegal?
That makes it illegal?
Yes. you're right. I guess I should be more specific. Segregation is illegal through the case of Brown versus Board of Education. And this is in 1954, but just know that it's in the 1950s. So this is not LBJ. This is not one of his doings. However, it is significant for the civil rights movement because it, hold on, let me word this differently. Whoa. It integrates schools. So this is one of the first Supreme Court cases that makes segregation illegal by forcing the races to come together. Selena, do you remember which case made segregation legal? You answered it on the little board game we played the other day. Starts with a P.
Plessy versus Ferguson.
Yes. So Plessy versus Ferguson makes segregation legal, and this is in 1896, long time ago, but it made it okay and it made it constitutional to separate the races as long as that separation was what? Separate but equal. And then really there's just one more thing that you need to understand with the civil rights movement. I mean, because we know who Martin Luther King Jr. is and like the I Had a Dream speech, but the one other thing is that you understand what civil disobedience is and examples of how people used it. So what is civil disobedience? This is still the civil rights movement. So civil disobedience is when someone resists the law, and that's kind of different than breaking the law. I mean, you are breaking the law because you're resisting it, but you're breaking it intentionally, not to be malicious and not to commit a crime and not to hurt anyone, but to show that you do not think that this law is right. So what are some examples, whereas in the civil rights movement, people resisted the law?
The dudes that sat at the restaurant or whatever in the white section.
Yes. The sit-ins. And the sit-in that you're talking about is the Greensboro sit-in. And that sit-in was at the restaurant at the lunch counter, and they sat. There were 4 black college students that sat in the white section, but their sit-in sparked a ton of sit-in movements across the countries and libraries and other places that were not currently integrated. And the buses, tell me about that.
What was her name sat in front of the bus, and like everyone flipped out about it, but she sparked something. I can't remember her name was.
Rosa Parks sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. But boycotting in general was a great way to demonstrate your resistance to the law, because by boycotting, you're refusing to do something or refusing to use a product. And so by Rosa Parks and all the other people who stood behind her, by refusing to ride the buses, they were showing, unless you change the law, unless you start to integrate the buses, we're just not going to ride them anymore. And then they're going to lose money. So any questions for the civil rights movement? Otherwise, we're going to move on to Johnson and Nixon. We already talked about LBJ, Johnson, and the sense of the civil rights movement, but there are other things that he does. And what was Johnson, or LBJ, it's the same person, what was his plan for fixing the economy? It was 2 words. LBJ's Great Society. So So he's a pretty busy guy because he's got all the civil rights and all this stuff going on, but then he's also focusing on the economy. So the Great Society, the plan was to lower unemployment and improve the plan was to lower unemployment and improve the economy. And what plan? This plan was like 30 years before this, but what plan is this really similar to?
The New Deal.
FDR's New Deal. So his plan is most similar.
Do you have to know that it was known as the War on Poverty, or that whatever that whole thing is?
The war on poverty? Yeah.
Is that with him, or what is it?
Yeah, that's with him. I was about to get to that. So, FDR's Great Society, though, is most similar to FDR's New Deal because both provided social welfare. What's a good example of social welfare?
Like
Medicaid and Medicare.
Medicaid, Medicare. Today, like these didn't exist then, but now it could be EBT, WIC, any type of like government economic assistance program is social welfare.
Does you know how like the government gives people like apartments? That sounds so weird, but does that fall into the same thing?
Gives people a purpose.
No, like housing, like apartments, like government
Oh.
apartments. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that's social welfare.
Okay.
Mhm.
That doesn't matter for anything. I just
That's
wanted
good.
to know.
Well, that part of that Fair Housing Act that LBJ created,
Mhm.
over the years, different presidents have kind of like added to it. And so in the 80s, when they added to the Fair Housing Act, they created Section 8, which if you've heard of like Section 8 housing, it's like government issued housing. So it all falls underneath this. So Johnson, in order to lower unemployment and improve the economy, he was going to what he called fight the war on poverty. But really, I mean, it's not like we weren't in a depression or a recession or anything, but he saw this problem. He didn't want it to get any worse, and so his solution was to, quote, fight the war on poverty. So how, I feel like this is going to get unorganized. How is he going to fight the war on poverty? What kinds of things is he going to do to help people not be poor?
He did something with like education, but I don't know what it is.
Yes, okay. So he believed that education is the key to success. If we want people to not be poor, they need to get a good education so that they can get a good job, so that they can provide for their family. So he implemented the education, the Education Opportunity Act, which gave money, and like a simple way to put it, it gave money to schools. And this was one of the first times that a president had set aside millions and millions of dollars to give to public schools. So he really focused on education. There are also programs that we talked about that you don't necessarily need to know, but if you want to write it down, you can. Programs like VISTA and Job Corps and Project Head Start. Project Head Start still exists, but those are like, Project Head Start is like a free preschool program to teach children how to read, to give them that head start before they go to kindergarten. Job Corps and VISTA were like pop-up training sessions for people who didn't have a job and would show them like how to write a resume, how to apply for a job, like how to do all these things that maybe nobody had ever showed them before. So it was still centered on education, just maybe in a different way. So how did Johnson provide for the poor? While he didn't give people free money or free jobs or college loans or anything like that, he did help people pay for their health care. So how did he help people pay for their health care?
Did we not already say that?
Did we?
Medicare.
Medicare, Medicaid?
Yeah.
Oh, we're gonna say it again. Medicare and Medicaid.
Didn't we like
Oh.
care for the old people? Is that what it was for?
For the poor.
Right. Medicare, old. Medicaid, poor. But this, just know that this is health care. So this might help pay for your prescriptions, pay for your doctor's visit, your hospital bill, whatever it might be. But this is just how you become eligible for these programs or social welfare systems. All right, let's talk about Nixon. And Nixon is elected in 1968. And so Nixon adopts all of these programs by LBJ, but he also adopts the fact that LBJ had gotten us involved into the Vietnam War, and now all these things become his problem. And what political party was Nixon a part of?
A Republican.
Yes, Nixon is a Republican, and LBJ had been a Democrat. So, because of this, Nixon tries to reverse everything LBJ did, including civil rights ideas. Nixon tried to not like get rid of the Civil Rights Act, but he definitely tried to pay less attention to it. He tried to pay less focus on it. Not because he was racist, he just didn't believe that it was something that was a problem for the United States. So he tried to reverse a lot of civil rights pieces of legislation, but he also tried to reverse any part of the Great Society, like Medicare and Medicaid. Because think about if LBJ is a Democrat and Nixon's a Republican, usually Democrats and Republicans have very different views on like social welfare and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. So he's going to try and just wipe everything away that LBJ had worked pretty hard to accomplish.
Okay, wait. So obviously it didn't work. Like he didn't reverse it because we still have those things. Is it because he was impeached that it didn't work?
Right.
Okay.
Good question. Because obviously we still have them. Yeah, so nothing really happened. But how these two men were different politically, they're different because one was a Republican and one is a Democrat. But economically, we talked about this in class today.
Who did we did?
Yeah. Economically, LBJ and Nixon were different because, can you think of anything? How are they different economically?
I don't know. Wait, hold on.
LBJ provided for the poor and improved the economy with the Great Society and social welfare. He did all these great things to make the economy for the United States better. Well, Nixon made it worse. And how he made it worse was through stagflation. And when I brought up stagflation, y'all are like, what in the world is that? But stagflation is not, okay, so you know how we talked about like the Great Depression wasn't Hoover's fault. He was just kind of there. Stagflation wasn't Nixon's fault. He just kind of walked into a bad situation. So stagflation is the mixture of debt from the Vietnam War.
I thought this was before the Vietnam War.
LBJ got us involved in the Vietnam War in 1965, and he becomes president in 1968.
Then why did we not talk about that first?
Because we're talking about these two men on like a political spectrum, and then we'll talk about the war.
That's confusing.
Well, here's a little timeline. LBJ is president from 1963 to 1967. The Vietnam War is from 1965 to 1975. And Nixon is president from 1968 to 1972.
We'll find out on Friday. Ooh.
So stagflation is a mixture of debt from the Vietnam War and a slow economy. I mean, sometimes business just isn't good, but that's why it's called stagflation. And the inflation comes from inflation, the debt from the war, and the stag, like stagnant, still, it comes from the slow economy. So that's why I say stagflation wasn't his fault, but he didn't, people compared him like, ooh, LBJ did all these great things, and LBJ helped the poor. Nixon, what are you doing? Nothing. Does that make sense? Okay.
Sure. I had a question, but it's dumb, so just.
All right. One more thing about Nixon, and then we'll talk about the war. So, on top of the bad economy, Nixon also gets impeached. And it doesn't matter if we talk about the war before or after, because the war doesn't have to do with Nixon's impeachment. So, Nixon impeachment.
Was it really plumbers, or was that just a joke that my class started? Because it really confused me.
No, they were called the plumbers.
I was just really confused. I don't
It's
know.
a terrible name, but
Okay.
they were called the plumbers. And there was actually another group called CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. So you got the plumbers and the creeps.
Like, so weird.
They couldn't think of anything better.
It don't matter. I'll say
So
it later.
Nixon's impeachment, it's not just like, ooh, one thing and then bam, but it's more of like a story. So how does the story begin with Nixon's impeachment?
He's sending those people.
Who?
No, that's not where it starts?
Yeah.
You said no.
I said who?
Oh, the plumbers, apparently. And then they go and they bugged the phones and they got caught.
I spell minions.
M-I-N, minions.
Iowan.
Minions.
So I just want you to know that the plumbers, they're Nixon's minions. They're like his little henchmen. Like they're gonna go out and do his dirty work. If you want to use a different word than minion, by all means.
No, because that's going to help me remember.
It just makes sense to me. So
Okay.
the plumbers, keep going,
Anytime.
Ryan.
Okay,
Minion.
they break into the Democratic something, the Watergate scandal.
Break into the Democratic National Committee's DNC headquarters,
And then,
which, hold on, and the headquarters are at the Watergate complex building, the Watergate building. Keep going. It's a paraphrase. What is this thing called?
Like how you type in your email.
Parentheses.
Parentheses. Thank you. They get caught.
Are you waiting for me to say that?
You said bugging the phones, right?
I mean, I guess that's what you told me, so I guess that's right.
They get caught bugging the phones, wiring the phones. Why are they trying to listen in on the Democrats' conversations?
I don't know, but
Because
why?
Nixon's worried.
About?
Getting impeached.
People against him.
Because what
And
party
talking
was
about
he?
him. Republican.
Republican. And he's breaking into the Democrats' headquarters, so he's worried about people talking about him. So he's like, I'm gonna just listen in on their
Just
conversations
wanna make it worse.
and dig up some dirt. So plumbers break in, they get caught.
It stinks. How did they get caught?
They were caught.
But someone just walked in like I just don't understand. I
Most
feel like there's more
likely
to it that's not
They,
being said.
they
that bothers
actually
me.
they left like they were like digging in files and they left like papers out, like they made it how do I
Like
say it?
obvious.
The
Obvious that they had been there, and I don't know, somebody figured it out that it was them who had broken in.
Okay.
So Nixon is tried. Who puts the president on trial when they're impeached?
Congress?
Yes, Nixon is tried by Congress. And found guilty of obstruction.
Isn't this the one that Trump was
Mhm.
on? Or like abusive power or something?
And abuse. He was found guilty because those are the only things a president can ever be impeached for. So it's kind of like, here's your options, find a way to make a person guilty of this. So he was made guilty of obstruction of justice and abuse of power, but Nixon quits or resigns before he's actually impeached.
So he was never impeached. Really?
Well, he was officially impeached, but he quits before they could like officially file and say, you sir are impeached, you have to leave now.
So technically he's not. Technically he just quit. Because he quit before he was technically impeached.
That would be like your boss is like, I'm gonna fire you tomorrow, and you're like, well then I'll just quit today. Like your boss is still gonna write down that he fired you because he'd already made that decision, but you just quit before he beat you to it.
He wanted to make sure.
Because if you Google, like, was Nixon impeached? Yes, he was. Because the House and the Senate both voted to impeach him. Was Donald Trump impeached? Yes, he was. But only by the House, not the Senate, so it didn't count.
Goodbye.
That makes sense. Alright, let's talk about the war.
Yeah, 'cause I know nothing.
Well, good thing we're all here.
Yeah, like,
Vietnam.
a freaking big pong? I don't even know what that is.
Did you say Bitcoin?
No! Whatever it's called! Those people, the two name ones, was like,
Vietnamese.
No.
Ho Chi Minh?
no.
Viet Cong.
Yep, that's what I said.
Okay. The Vietnam War.
Hold on, wait, pause.
Where to begin? Let's write some years up here. So it started in Vietnam in 1955 and ended in 1975, but the United States doesn't join until 65 and we leave in 73. Because it's like there's two wars in one. Vietnam, they're doing their own thing for 10 years before we even get there. So when we're talking about like France and all this stuff happening in Vietnam, America's not there yet. We have no troops there yet. So let us start from the beginning. In the beginning. Where to start? Alright, so Vietnam.
Oh, that's why I don't
was a, yeah, this is when my, yeah.
Yep.
Vietnam was a colony of France. Yes, does this sound familiar? Vietnam was a colony of France. After World War II, Vietnam left France. So-
Oh, you really start from the beginning.
Yes, but that's where it all begins. Vietnam left France after World War II, so 1946. But this is where the problems begin, because once Vietnam left France, Vietnam becomes influenced by what?
Communism.
Communism. You see where we're going with this? Who was the man who started these communist ideas in Vietnam?
Did it start with H?
Uh-huh.
The Ho Chi Minh dude.
Ho Chi
I know
Man.
that's like something that you call someone who
M-I-N.
English. Like a Ho Chi Minh. You know?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's an H. It's like H
I
in or
thought
something.
so.
Oh,
I was seeing if I had it written down, because I'm like, is there an H in that?
I thought it was H N.
Ho Chi Minh might be.
Let me
It
look.
is.
Very well.
That don't look right.
That looks
No.
wrong. That looks way wrong.
It looks wrong. It
Hold
just-
on, let me look. I knew this wing would probably put it on the thing.
Min? I guess that is how you would say min.
I don't know. You know about it more than I do.
Ho Chi.
Just keep going.
So,
From that.
when you see him though, associate him with the
Okay.
communist beginnings in Vietnam. So in 1955, the United States, as well as several of our other allies, begin the Geneva Accords. So in 1955, has the United States joined the war yet?
No.
No, we haven't. But here we are with the Geneva Accords, which was a peace plan to prevent war. I'm just gonna put Nam, okay? Because I'm tired of writing Vietnam. No, I won't. I won't.
No,
put it to you.
you can. It's just I'm tired of writing it too. You need to shorten it. What? I don't know.
So in 1955, the Geneva Accords were going to be a peace plan to prevent war in Vietnam. So we see Ho Chi Minh, we see the things that he is doing, and we're trying to prevent that from happening with the Geneva Accords or the Geneva Peace Plan. And it was going to do two things. It was going to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel.
But I thought they were one.
They are now. We tried to divide them. We were going to say communism, go to the north, Democrats or democracy come to the south, just like we had divided North and South Korea. So we were going to divide Vietnam and hold an election. We were going to let the Vietnamese people choose for themselves, would you like to be communist or would you like to have a democracy? And what happened was we actually ended up calling the election off because guess who we realized the Vietnamese people were going to vote for?
Communist.
The communists. They were going to vote for Ho Chi Minh. And we're like, ooh, can't have that. So we canceled the elections altogether. And in 1955, when the elections were canceled, guess what starts?
The war.
The war. The Geneva Accords failed and the Vietnam War began. Not for America, but just in general, okay? So hold on, one more thing. What is the fear of Vietnam falling to communism and then all these other countries falling to communism? What is that called?
The domino
Yeah,
effect.
the domino, yeah. Is the fear of countries, specifically in Southeast Asia, falling.
Does this be in those in Southeast Asia? You don't have to write it out.
In Southeast Asia. Falling to communism. So whenever we talk about a war, we always talk about like that one event that caused us to join the war. So like the Spanish-American War, it was the USS Maine. World War II, it was Pearl Harbor. So what is that one event that caused America to join the Vietnam War?
It was something to do with their disagreement with communism spreading.
Well, we had the policy of containment. So, hold on, let's think. Why did the United States join the Vietnam War? Number one, to implement the policy of containment.
It says
What?
But okay.
Well, I'm not done. Number one, and then there's going to be a number two. So, Selena, what was the policy of containment? Come on, we gotta contain something. We gotta keep it from spreading. During the Cold War.
Is that when they kept the Jews? No?
No.
I don't even know.
Containing communism.
We gotta contain communism. We gotta keep communism from spreading. Communism is about to spread through Vietnam, so we gotta contain it. We gotta prevent it from spreading even further. But reason number two, what does your lovely little paper say?
that and the Cold War. That's all it says.
To prevent the Cold War?
No, it says why communism and the Cold War.
Oh,
Is that wrong?
no, that makes sense.
To prevent the Cold War.
Like, this is taking place within the Cold War.
And then it says those people tried to take over South Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it is.
So, that one event, though, that's like, boom, this happens, now America is going to join the war, is the Gulf of Tonkin.
You knew that, didn't you?
No, I can't remember.
The Gulf of Tonkin. So, the Gulf of Tonkin, let's see, how do we sum this up?
Sum it up. I don't even know what it is.
America is caught spying on Vietnam because the Gulf of Tonkin is like a body of water, just like the Gulf of Mexico. So we are in the Gulf of Tonkin and we are caught spying on the Vietnamese and they catch us. And it says that we are engaged by Vietnamese submarines. And Johnson, oh, by the way, this is during, just for we're not confused, this is during LBJ's presidency because this is in 1965. So he's still president.
So really, we got ourselves pulled into this.
Yes. And Johnson uses the fact that we were engaged by these Vietnamese submarines. What does that mean? Did they shoot us? Did we shoot them? Like, it was so loose, we don't know. But he uses that excuse to send troops to Vietnam because he viewed Vietnam as being aggressive towards us. So this led, the Gulf of Tonkin, this little incident of us getting caught spying, led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is what gave the president, so in this case LBJ, the power to send troops without whose approval?
Governments.
Specifically, what branch of the government?
Congress.
Congress. Without Congress's approval. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions are super important because they're so controversial, and this was the first time, and really, I think only the only time, that the president has been able to just do something without using checks and balances, without Congress's approval. So, how would people criticize this? Why would people not think that this is a good idea?
I mean, really, you're kind of going into it blind.
We're going into something blind, and the president is not being checked behind. People aren't giving him their opinions and making sure he's making a good decision, and it goes against checks and balances. Because of the fact that nobody is checking up behind him and making sure he's making good decisions for our country. How is this reversed? We clearly don't have this anymore. So after the end of the war, Congress created something else to not get rid of this, but just kind of decrease it a little bit. Does anybody remember what that's called?
What?
You remember what that's called?
What?
The plan to decrease the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and take some of this power away. It's called the War Powers Act. And this is after the war, so after the Vietnam War is over, but it takes away some of that presidential power, that executive power, and I don't know if I can squeeze this in here. Well, I'm just gonna write 48 hours, but now the president has to inform Congress with a 48-hour notice if he's going to send troops into a hostile or an aggressive area. So he can still send troops without Congress's approval. He just has to give them a little bit of a heads up first. A 48-hour notice. Can I move this? So let's talk about the end of the war. How does the war end? Well, does America win or lose? Kind of lose. Because
We left.
we left in 73 and the war doesn't end till 75. So what's the future of Vietnam? What have they become now? Vietnam is a communist country. And they are one country, they are one united nation, unlike Korea, which is north and south, which also means that containment failed in Southeast Asia. But specifically though, like what signaled the end of the war, we knew that the war was over when Saigon fell. Saigon is a city in South Vietnam. It's a city in South Vietnam. It was actually the capital of South Vietnam. So when the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh captured that city, that's when we knew the war was officially over.
Do you happen to know anything about Agent Orange?
Agent
Do
Orange?
you have to, like, I know what it is, but do we happen to know the details? Because I just feel like they're irrelevant to this.
Not really.
Or like
It's not.
fragging or any of that stuff that's on this.
No, you don't need to know fragging. Agent Orange it's not irrelevant, but it's not like a super complicated political concept. It's a chemical. So it was called Operation Ranch Hand because have you ever seen like where they fly over like fields and drop the chemicals for like fertilizing, it's the same thing. They dropped these chemicals all over Vietnam to kill the plants and the trees so that the Viet Cong couldn't use them to hide behind. And they were called rainbow pesticides or rainbow herbicides because there was like Agent Orange, Agent Blue, Agent White, all different colors for the different types of pesticides.
Isn't it still affecting them, like the birth of their children and stuff?
Yeah. We talked about that yesterday.
Yesterday.
Yeah, it was yesterday.
Oh.
One more thing though. So when we were talking about the Gulf of Tonkin, that was during LBJ's time in 1965. But when Nixon is elected in 68, his plan is to bring peace, right? And he's like, vote for me and I'm gonna end the war. So how does Nixon implement peace for Vietnam? 2 things he does or tries to do to bring peace to the war. Or peace to end the war, at least.
Oh, the D word. Is that what
Yes,
it is?
that's one of the...
Detente, or whatever the freaking it's
Detente.
called. Detente, yeah. That's what Captain told me last week.
Detente. But it's détente. You pronounce it détente.
Oh.
But this is the easing of relations. So to ease relations between America and who?
Nope.
Yeah,
USSR.
the USSR. Because this is just going to get to the source. Like Vietnam, yeah, they're a problem, but who's the big problem? The USSR. So we're going to cut it at the source. And then number 2, I heard you whisper it to Catherine. What?
Actually, I was kind of an answer you said at the same time, but it's Vietnamization. I still don't know what that means, though.
Vietnamization is when we were going to trade. Don't check the spelling. Don't check.
I'm not writing it like that. That's gonna confuse me.
I am like 90% sure that's right.
Close
And I'm
enough.
about 90% sure it's not on this paper.
It's close enough.
Just go with it. Don't worry about spelling. I'll worry about that
I
part.
have it right here. Just hold
Wait,
on.
how's it pronounced?
Vietnamization. Vietnama.
You just wrote Vietnam way too many times. That's
Vietnam. N-A. I lost it. M-I-Z-A-T-I-O-N.
One moment.
Close. Oh.
Vietnamization is when it was Nixon's plan to. Golly. Let me just write it down. Americans were going to train
I don't have to road.
the South Vietnamese. Americans were going to train the South Vietnamese so that we could leave and they could fight the war for themselves. But it was going to be a very gradual, slow, like, takes a long time to train somebody how to do something. So this was going to be a process.
I don't think you spelled Vietnamese.
No,
You know what? This is not a spelling
It's
test,
definitely
people.
E and an S and an E.
Yep.
Vietnamese.
No.
This is Vietnamese.
Yeah, that is what that says.
Okay.
Sorry. Madison, talk to Kaylin about tomorrow, please. Thank you.
Any questions? Nope. Look at that.
Not that
4 o'clock.
happened there for time.
Oh.